Okay. So continuing with Pug, I'm going to go into more code. So inside of Pug, we have a regular for loop if we wanted to do a for loop to iterate over elements to display it on the screen, as well as we have the ability, if anyone is more familiar, we've used it a couple of times in class, but an array has a for each method, and this is kind of similar, like a for each statement where we have each item in the list, and when we reference that item, it will be, in this case, it would be uno, dos, tres, as you can see on the right-hand side here. You'll see sometimes that there's a difference between buffered and unbuffered code, or escaped and unescaped code. This is where, when we're trying to deal with code that's coming from a server, usually from a user, you guys have gone over like SQL injection, where when something is sent always from the user to the server, you don't want to trust it because sometimes people are trying to break it on purpose. And this is the same thing. So coming back, they reference the tags that you can use for less than or greater than. But really, again, a lot of this, we're not going to use it. This isn't a security class. We just want stuff to work on the screen. Let's see, just a couple other ones. So conditionals, same thing. We can do an if statement. So we have an if, an else if, and an else that depending on, in this case, it's looking for a truthy value. Does anyone, or who does not know what the term of either truthy or falsy means? A couple people. So in JavaScript, because stuff can either be there, or let's compare it to Java. You guys have all done Java, right? They haven't removed that from the college, unfortunately. But in Java, you always know that something's going to be there. If you create an integer, you know that that value is always going to be an integer. Whereas in JavaScript, you can change something from being an integer to a string, for better or for worse. Sometimes values can be there and sometimes values are not there. So instead of checking that something is not undefined and something is not null, we have the ability to just check of doing if user.description. And what that will do is if there is a user.description, and it's a, it's, actually let me open up a truthy and falsy chart. So there's a lot to it, but obviously when we check a Boolean value of either true or false, we know if something is true, it's a yes. If it's false, it's a no. And same thing, usually sometimes people will represent a Boolean as either a 1 or 0 because that's what binary is ones and zeros. Or you can think of it as power on, power off. But when we start dealing with other values, so a 1 that is a string is considered true. And the reason for that is JavaScript will do type conversion and convert that 1 to a number as the 1, which will then obviously be true. And then for a 0, it will convert it into the number 0, which is false. -1, according to this, is neither true or false. So I don't know how that works. That seems wrong. But something that is, this part is correct, is an empty string is false. So if something is not there, if it's null, or it's an empty string, we know in this if statement right here, we want to display the description. However, if that description does not exist, then we end up checking if someone is authorized. And then we end up displaying this message, and then otherwise we display that. So looking at it, the state of variables in JavaScript can be a little bit confusing. But knowing what types get converted to, it also allows you to write your code sometimes a little bit shorter instead of having to check numerous things. So I think that's just enough to going over Pug for right now. But what we're going to be doing is installing to our machines the Express generator, which for those of you who have come in just after I've explained it, the Express generator is a tool that we're going to use on our machines to scaffold out our project for us. So if you type in onto your machine this command that's right here, npm I, you can type in npm install, I is just a shortcut, express generator, and then using the -g so that we install it globally. I'll also just open it up in here. Let me close these. Documents, Georgian, Tuesday, week 4. Okay, I'll bump up the font size for you. So in order to install it, let me just put it at the top of my screen so those of you at the back can see a little bit easier. So we just type in npm install express-generator not double dash save, just -g for global. So it was pretty quick on my machine because I already have it installed, but Express Generator is not very big, so if it happens very quick on your machine, it's a good thing. For those of you that are on Windows machines, it can take a little bit longer just because of NPM permissions that it has to go through. But even then, it still should be pretty quick. If anyone is having issues, you're having an issue?
Yeah, the permission denied both of us in the Mac.
Okay, are both of you guys on Slack? Yeah? Okay, I'm going to put in a command for you to run. Sometimes, so Node has both issues on Windows and Mac, which is fun.
I got it.
You got it? Okay, cool. But when running on Mac, sometimes we use what is called NVM, which is the Node version manager, and it handles a lot of that permission stuff behind the scene for us, so we don't have to. So if you end up, yep.
I just type it sudo.
Sudo, yeah. Sudo can sign, that's where sometimes it actually gets into issues. When you run sudo, it will force it to work, but it's not always the best way to do it. But if you just want to do it, I mean, at the end of the day, like, doesn't really matter. But let me just do nvm. Do this one. I'll throw this in the Tuesday chat. So this command will only work if you're actually on a Mac or probably on a Linux machine as well, any sort of like Unix operating system except for Windows. And if you just run this, it'll install NVM onto your machine. Then you will have to probably type in nvm install 10 nvm alias default 10, and then you can just type in the npm install express generator g. If it's already working on your machine, don't bother doing it. So in order to use the express generator, we just end up typing in express. If you're already in the directory that you're wanting to do it, so there's two different ways that you can do it. So in this case, I'm going to remove the directory that I'm in. And when I run this command, it's going to create a new folder. So in this case, we just type in express, followed by the name of the folder that we want. I'm going to call mine week 4. And then we do --view equals pug. And this is specifying that we're going to be using pug for our templating engine. Also, does someone want to get the lights for me just so that it's easier for people to see? Thank you. So express week 4 --view equals pug. And it's pretty quick, and it creates some files for us, which we will go over. So let me open that. Oh, not open. Code.
show the command again?
Yes, sorry.
So
Is that what your question was at the back as well? Just, yeah, okay.
if you're already in the directory,
You can
wanna
just
put it
use
in-
a period instead of specifying the folder name. So it would be express space period space _view equals pug. Is anyone having issues running this command? That's good. That's way less than I had yesterday. So these are all the files that it'll create for us and folders. We have a bin folder, which is called www. This is where we've set up in past classes our Express application. So in here, this is where we have our port number. It's using the HTTP module for listening on that port, creates a server. It automatically handles, it has an on error function, so if there's any sort of errors that happen in Node, it'll just be handled inside of here. And then on listening is a function that runs just saying that it's listening on port 3000 when we run our application. So that part we can pretty much just ignore. You'll see that we have our package JSON file. One student asked me yesterday, do we have to do npm init for our application? We don't. That was automatically handled for us when we used the Express generator. You'll see that we have some dependencies that are already listed in here. We have debug, express, HTTP errors, Morgan, pug, and cookie parser. So where the brains of our application is going to be is under app.js. And there's a lot in here, so don't worry if you don't understand it all. Most of it is not really relevant to what we're doing. But if we compare it to the other projects that we've worked on before, we require an express at the top of our application. We end up executing express right here and creating a variable called app. Let me increase the font size. In here, like in our lab 2 doing the calculator, we have app.use, and then in this case it's on the index, and we have an index router, which is requiring in our route right here. We also have a users router that's on /users. Then we have a catch-all that is app.use that automatically ends up creating a 404 error. So that way, if our application, if we haven't set anything up for it, it will default to being a 404, and we can handle it how we want to handle it instead of it just erroring out on the server. And then down here is an error handler for being able to display the error on the page. So as handy as the Express generator is, the one thing that it does not do is automatically npm install our modules for us. So if you want to go into your directory and then type in npm install, and it will install that all for us. The other thing that we should do after installing, because we're going to be developing on our machine, is we want to install nodemon onto our machine. So I will type in npm install /save dev nodemon. So again, npm install /save dev nodemon, and then just a regular npm install. So if you want to see if npm install has worked on your machine, all you have to do is just type in npm start, and if you don't get any errors in your terminal, then you've installed your modules correctly. So if you open to localhost 3000, you'll be greeted by a title that says Express, saying welcome to Express. Is there anyone that's having issues having this working right now? Yeah. Where are you at?
So npm start. Couldn't find the path.
Are you?
Do I need to be in the folder we just made?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you need to be in the folder that you just made in order to npm install npm install nodemon and in order to run npm start.
Okay.
Yep. Some errors are popping up.
Are you just writing it? How can you do this when you go?
Oh, Control Shift this key.
Yes. So you have it that two folders that use the same function. So if you open up your two file.
Yeah, because
Oh, is that right?
Yes. So if you
so we
open up your
have this.
command prompt and type
Yes.
cd
Okay.
We have
space left three, and then do that again. So npm install.
Oh, okay.
and we have
Yep.
Can you open the tube shells actually?
over here.
Yeah, here.
It's PowerShell.
So are you wanting to move it to?
Yeah, okay.
So
I have you should.
Yeah, but you have it dash.
Oh, I think in your settings you get to choose which one.
Oh, in the
Yeah.
CSS code?
Yeah.
There's so just npm install. Oh, same that.
Yeah.
Just npm install. Dash dash save dash dash dash
Yes.
dash
Save that.
save.
you have
I love it. Dash dash tab. Dash dash
so you have
So just install.
oh, just the dash save dash.
I feel like this one would be so hard.
My keyboard. Start. No, it says no. Cannot find module cookie parser. You have it though. There you go, that's it.
Is anyone else having issues on the machine? Vlad?
It says can't find the cookie parser, however it is here in the package.
It is in your package, but it is not installed yet. And then run that after. Okay. Is there anyone? So if you type in, if you're in the right folder and you type in npm space start and you go into your web browser and type in localhost 3000, if you do not have this screen, please let me know so that way we can get you situated.
Yeah, it's like you're running the server.
Now,
That's fine.
go back to the store.
CNN travels. Breakfast around the world find it on this Saturday. And they say that where is it? So then there you go. KBR is actually a Russian breakfast. It is a freaking bullshit.
Oh.
Because COPR it's expensive shit, right?
Yeah.
Like what we have for record is this. Slice of bread.
Come on.
So you guys all good? And I don't know what's up.
Is everyone good over there?
Just like how I said. Like maybe.
All right. So now that we have our server actually working on our machine, Vlad, I'm just going to have to ask you to lower your volume. Now we're going to change our package JSON file to using nodemon to register our new changes that we're going to be making to our application. So inside of your terminal, both on Windows and Mac, if you just hit Control-C, on Windows you're going to have to hit Y to confirm that you're wanting to cancel it. But to make that change, we're going to open up our package JSON file. In this case, I'm under week 4. Whatever it is on your machine, just go to the folder that you created and go to package JSON. And we're going to create a new script. Remember, scripts are kind of like shortcuts that are going to be in our application, so that way we don't have to type it out every time. So we're just going to type in, at the end of our start, we want to put a comma, and we'll have dev in quotes, and it'll be nodemon. And instead of having server.js, we're going to be having ./bin/www. You can just copy what is available right above. You had a question? Yes, give me a sec. Is that good? Cool. So again, the only change that we've made right here is with our scripts, and we just put in dev nodemon bin www. So to now run nodemon as our script, instead of typing in npm start, we will now type in npm run dev. And if you're greeted by these 3 lines of yellow and 1 line of green, then you've properly done it. If you're not greeted by those colors, your terminal might not also display colors. But if you refresh the application, it should still work. So for any of our Express work that we're going to be doing, this is pretty much the same steps that we're going to be making from week to week, if we don't just copy the code that we did the week before. So, but you can see that very quickly, once you get in the habit of being able to run the Express generator, there's a lot that is handled for you that you don't have to do and you don't have to memorize. So if we look at the structure a little bit more of our application, also, is anyone still copying down what is on here? If you're not, let me know if you're having any issues, and I'll try to. You're good, or you're still copying? Okay. So I'll just open it on the side here. So if we look at the other folders that came with our Express generator, besides the bin folder that we looked at previously, there's a views folder, a routes folder, and a public folder. Does anyone want to take a guess on what the routes folder is? Yep. Kind of. So routes is where our server logic for our links is going to lie. So when you guys have gone over Model View Controller inside with ASP.NET, our routes folder is the same thing as our controllers folder. So this is where all the logic that happens on our server when certain URLs in our application get hit. So in this case, we have the index.js, which is on the index of our site. It ends up rendering an index, and it passes this object saying title express. So there's a lot of magic that is actually happening here that you might be a little bit confused on. So Because we've already registered pug.js inside of our application, we have the ability to use res.render, and it automatically knows that we want to render our index.pug file that is under our views. So our views is where all of our HTML is going to live. Well, I say HTML in quotes. This is where our front-end logic is going to live that gets compiled into HTML. But by typing in res.render and giving it a string of index, it knows that it wants to render this index.pug file. And then we end up passing it an object that has a title of string. So if we actually open up index.pug, you'll see there's the same reference to a variable. Title inside of our res.render here. And in here we have title and welcome to title. So if I open these side by side with my browser, whoops. That is full screen. There we go. So I'm just going to close that. So if I end up changing the title that's right here from express to example, and I refresh, using that object that we're sending to our template, it's able to render that onto the screen. So inside of our index.js is where we would do any sort of calls to a database to get information that we could then pass to our view to render onto the screen. But you can also see that if this was a valid HTML file, we would have like our doc, our HTML you guys have used. We can use one layout file and be able to use that same layout across all of our different pages. So in this case, our layout.pug file is pretty basic. It just has a doc type HTML, then HTML, our head, with a title, a link to a style sheet, our body, and then this thing that's called block content. So in order to pass blocks of code from, in this case, we have our index file that is extending off of our layout, we end up using what are called blocks. Blocks can be named whatever you want. If I wanted to just create another block of example, I could just actually get rid of this content one and change this block to being called block example. So, but what is important to know is when we extend off of a layout, the only things that can be at 0 indentation is our extends layout, block for our content, and then also what is called a mixin, which we will go into a little bit later in today's class. But a block is just code that you can end up putting into another layout. And there's a couple different things that we can do. We can end up actually replacing content. So if I put this back to saying block content, and this one back to block content, say we're working on a website and we have our JavaScript on the front end. But sometimes we're working on a page that needs additional JavaScript only on that one page. What we can end up doing is we can have our default scripts on every single page, and then when we go to that specific page, we can give it different scripts. So that way we're not loading the same scripts on every single page. But by default, when we use a block, it will always replace what is in there. So your first thought might be, well, I'll just copy what is in my layout file and then add my additional scripts. But what's nice about block is you can also append. So you can say block append content, and then that will add it to the content. So if I just did an example right here, layout h1 or h1. So I have my layout h1, and then I have my example h1 coming from my index file. However, if I removed the append, it would just replace it. So there's some fun stuff that you can end up doing to having like defaults. I believe you can also use prepend, yeah, and you can end up putting stuff in front of it. So those are like the three things that you do. You have replacing, prepending, and appending of any sort of blocks to your layout. And what's nice about layouts is, or I say layouts, don't be confused by just, I don't mean layout.pug, I mean any layout that you're extending from. You can have layouts that extend from other layouts, as well as you can have, say you can have like 2 or 3 different layouts that will be used in different portions of your site. Say you have an admin section that's going to look quite different than your user-facing side. You can have 2 different layouts that your application will extend off of. But to make our lives easier as programmers, I'm just going to put in Bootstrap into our layout file so that way we can have some basic styling that we're going to use. So this can be a good start at being able to take something and then converting it into Pug. Copy it. So you can see that we already have, as mentioned, we have a style sheet that's already in our layout file. And in order to take the one from Bootstrap, we can just have both. I'm going to remove it just because I don't like the styling that it comes with. But to convert the link that's on Bootstrap's website of using their cloud-hosted CSS, we just remove the tags that are at the end, and then we can wrap everything in parentheses. And then we'll do the same thing with the script tags at the bottom. In this case, I'm just going to put it in a block called scripts. You don't have to do that. So again, we can remove these starting, we can remove the ends, and wrap it in parentheses. So I will full screen this so that way you can see it a little bit easier. Also, quick question. So the last class that I taught, they prefer me to have word wrapping on. Do you guys prefer word wrapping to be on or off? Word wrapping, so in this case, you can see my line 6 is actually 6, 7, 8, and it just brings it all onto the next line. It might be easier for you guys to read, but sometimes when stuff gets really long, it can be a little bit confusing, especially as we're doing white space sensitive files. But for right now, I can just leave it as is, and if you guys start to get confused, just let me know. I want to make this as easy for you guys as possible. So I'm going to, right now, I'm going to commit my code onto GitHub. But if we open up our file, you'll see that if we refresh, it should change what its styling is. So if you've implemented Bootstrap onto your site correctly, it should change it from being padding on the body to being right up tight against the side, and the font should change. So I will push this onto GitHub. Ooh. And if you are also following along with me and wanting to put it on GitHub, there is one other thing that we should also be doing, which is creating our git ignore file, which we just put at the root of our application, and we want to ignore our git or our node modules folder. Again, at this point, let's see, if I opened up in Finder, our node modules folder, we have in this folder is 7,266 items, which is way more than any of the files that we've created for our application. So by ignoring our node modules, we don't push it up to GitHub to reduce our size up there, especially on like slower internet connections when you're at home. So after doing that, you can do git init. I will git add everything. I will do a commit of first commit. And then on GitHub, I will create a new repository. So COMP2068, summer 2019, week 4, and this is the Tuesday class. I'm going to create my repository, add the remote branch, and git push u origin master. And I'll also throw this in our folder for today. So under week 4, under weekly learning, the web link for the GitHub code is now there. I'll also throw in a web link for the pug.js documentation, as well as a link to the express generator, if you need to do it on a different machine when you get home. Okay. So I say that we're at a good spot to being able to take a break. We're kind of a little bit early for the top of the hour, but I'm not going to start programming for 7 minutes and then going on a break. So if for those of you that want to take a break, if you want to be here at 10 after 7, and then we'll continue working on this. If there's anyone that is having difficulties on their machine, now would be a good time to take advantage of that, and I can help you get caught up to where we are in class right now. So if those of you who want to go get a coffee, feel free to do so. I'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. Yes?
Can you just go back to the text file that we have?
The index file? .pug or JS?
How did you get those?
Oh,
If you want some highlight the program
So I have the
actually, you have to do that. But GitHub sessions in your still.
By the way, where is
She's back. She was at a conference last week.
that's actually
It was a tech conference in Toronto. Startups and foreign startups.
is she actually still like studying
Yeah, he's still a full-time student.
here in Georgia?
Yeah.
But like where I didn't see her.
Oh, really? Might just be sections, because you're in a lot of my classes, right?
Yeah.
And I have no classes at all in Virginia because we're in. Oh, no, I have one, but for the most part we're in different sections.
Gotcha.
Yes.
And is she in the makeup still like?
Yeah.
Georgiana?
I think she's still a full-time student. She's also working there part-time. Actually, I mean, she's always there.
I just was curious because like previously Virginia was all over the place.
Yeah.
So if you just want to like
Yeah. Still
Yeah.
very involved in stuff.
Sorry?
Grown like
So
yeah.
let me open it up on the screen for you.
Yeah, if you follow
So you just use script and then open parentheses and then the same content that you put in as a
I follow her on Instagram. It's
so
like
if you just take
a list of everything
what's
happening
probably
with
would be
Georgian.
easiest is if you take the code
Not
that's
quite,
on Bootstrap's website and put it
I
into
know that
that
there's a
HTML to
actual
J
they had an idea of
website.
this.
It'll spit out
No, with someone like to make a board game.
And then
I kinda
Oh,
interested.
yeah, Charlie.
I'm kinda interested in that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to participate in creating any kind of games. Just
Oh, no.
experience doing that.
Just Google Bootstrap. I'm not sure what.
In board games?
Whatever. Board game is like game.
Yeah. Even Charlie's still interested in that.
Get Bootstrap.
That's Charlie's idea?
Yeah.
And then if you click Get Started. Scroll down a little bit.
In terms of video games, though, you're the one in the program I know is most into, like, actually.
And then games, that one up there is your CSS.
Is there as much coding as thinking out? Like, it's
Yes.
like
Designing.
So that was what
yeah,
I-
yeah,
And
most really harsh part of the concordant is designing the game is that you need to pitch your ideas.
Inside of your
So
Yeah.
people will launch, and this is a hell of a thing.
Yeah.
Like with my buddy that we are thinking out the game, like the plot, everything around you, we argue like every single second. We even beat each other after an hour. It is kind of hard to say that this is
No, I
normal.
called him yesterday and gave him shit.
But now I kind of understand
How
why
long is it gonna
people
take,
who
right?
are
Like,
involved
I'm
in
at
development
such
are
a
like
meetings and I do not know.
confident than coming out because
Like,
they burn
they're
out.
still waiting on an estimate and they still haven't
Yeah, it's
heard
like
back
it's
from the other
stress
person's
when you
insurance yet.
drop his person
spaces.
That's like, bro.
and like why people crunch.
So I started looking up like prices for new
They
cars.
like most of them are working for the and they
I'm looking at the
They can kill you.
the Ford
For the
Focus
idea.
titanium, the hatchback ones. So
So,
like that. I found
okay,
two that are
yeah,
eight
don't
thousand
take
five
it.
hundred to go for walks.
Sure.
That are really good. They look really good.
actually
I
you know
don't
what?
want to get another car that I have to invest like $1,000 in repairs every 4
Fruits,
months.
coffee, or whatever it
So,
is.
and I want a hatchback. I love having a hatchback. There's so much room. It's all yeah, especially like for me as I have a dog, right? And then going to and from Halifax every couple of months, right? Exactly. And so the one I was looking at it has things like
Whatever one that you're
Bluetooth built in. It's got like a screen, so it's got like a rear, like a backup camera. It's got like GPS all built right in, everything right. It's like, yo, it's so convenient rather than me having to like plug in all this external shit to get the dashboard. I hope it doesn't have to come to that. I hope I can still use my car. But worst case scenario, because if I get my car back, then I can start putting a little bit of money in space. No way. And then once I find it does crap out on its own, I can just get a new one without going into more debt.
I was talking to my dad because he's a mechanic and aircraft mechanic. He was at Pearson International. He's like, oh, they're gonna write that thing off.
Oh yeah.
So for those of you that are using different editors, either than Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code like Sublime, in different ones you can actually set up settings to make sure that you always use a consistent indentation. So actually in my editor on here, if I search for spaces, so right here is a setting in my editor that allows me that when I hit the tab key, it actually does spaces instead of actually using the tabs. An issue with Pug is that because it's white space sensitive, it needs to know the indentation. So if you're mixing between spaces and tabs, it can actually confuse the parser because spaces are done a little bit different than tabs. Because some people will use 2 spaces and that's one indentation. Other people will use 3, some use 4. There's a lot of good arguments about what is the proper way to indent. There isn't, but that's where some of the confusion of the parser is starting to get into. So if you want to look into that, it's not necessary, but it just might make your lives a little bit easier. So, did you get that working? Yeah? Cool. Awesome.
If you pull the stuff you put up on GitHub, what do you need to do to like get it running? 'Cause since
So
we have, like, no
once you
modules
clone it,
Yeah.
then you just you cd into that directory and just type in npm install, and then it will work. Yep.
Regarding the lab one.
Yep.
The value, the one which you
Mhm.
the HTML one, I was just trying to do that. That is not the right one.
Oh,
If you
okay.
try lab money dash lab one,
Okay.
that is working.
Gotcha. Do you want to just resubmit that? Just repost it so that way it shows up in my box.
Everything is there in that one. If you want
Yeah,
to-
and just if you just resubmit it on Blackboard, so that way it shows up in my grade center to mark it. It just makes it easier for
Oh
me.
yeah, no problem. I can do it just
Yeah.
now. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, wow, there was a bunch of people that just registered from this class. Okay.
What was the command again to run it using nodemon?
So I created a script, and you can just type in npm run dev. So npm run will, and then followed by any sort of script that's in the package file, will run that script.
Okay. I was just missing the run. That's
Yep.
why I was-
Yes. So start is a automatically recognized word, so you can just
Yeah.
do it no problem. But any of the custom scripts you have to use npm run. Yours is not working? Do you want help getting it working? It shouldn't take too long.
Should be fine.
I just pulled his off GitHub.
That's what I was thinking because mine wasn't working.
Such a cheater. It's just because there's the due date on it, and it just automatically lets me know when people submit it late, but you obviously submitted it before, I can see that on GitHub, so. Okay. So, to circle back to lab 3, what we're needing to do is setting up a route for every person for our family. So in this case, I have one brother, I have a wife, I have my parents. So I'm going to set up 5 different routes that will be for, again, both my parents, myself, my wife, and my brother. So in order to do that, because we're already in our index.js, this means that every single route that is coming off of our index will go into here. So in this case, our index / and then Chris will work off of our index route here. So I'm going to do a get on /Chris, and I'm going to res.render a file called Chris, and I'm going to pass it nothing right now. So obviously you can replace Chris with your own name. If you want to use Chris, you're more than welcome to. Thanks, Vlad. That wasn't disruptive at all.
Well, I had to say sorry. Probably late, so I didn't mention.
So if I open up the app.js file and just put it side by side with our index, let me close this now. As mentioned right here, so off of our index, we're using our index router. So that way, anything that's off of the initial part of our URL, anything that we add into our router.gets in this file will add to it. So in our users router, if we put this exact same code into our users router, it would actually be /users/Chris. But I'm going to copy paste this 4 more times for my 4 other users that I want in here. So in this case, I'm going to have a route of /Rebecca that's going to render a file called Rebecca. I'm going to have one that's called Andrew that's going to render a file called Andrew. Dean, which renders Dean. And Cindy, which renders Cindy. So on the surface, you can see with this that we're taking the exact same string, and then where that will be a little bit different is if we wanted to send some sort of variables to those files that would be different. So in this case right now, we're not rendering, or we're not passing anything. But if we wanted to, we could end up passing some variables uniquely for Chris as opposed to Rebecca. So if you haven't tried it, I would suggest going to your application and trying to go to one of the routes, and you'll be greeted with an error. So it says, failed to look up view Chris in views directory, and it says where that directory is. And the reason for this is because we haven't created our Chris file yet. So it doesn't know how to it doesn't know what to render. And instead of just erroring out, it gives us a actual friendly message of what the error is. But in our file, in our views file, or views folder, if I created a file called chris.pug, and I'm just going to copy what is in the index file, just for now. and just replace the title. So in this case, H1 is going to be Chris Naismith, and rendered the Chris page. And in this case, I'm not going to use prepend anymore. I'm just going to use block content because I just want to replace everything that is in that block content. And again, these names can be whatever you want. So as of right now, I'm just going to commit this code as you copy it off the screen to GitHub. So with the way that we've currently laid everything out, and again, we're going to refactor this as we go. If we wanted to have the Rebecca route, we'd have to create another view for Rebecca, and then Dean and Andrew and Cindy. So as of right now, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to copy it. I need 4 different ones. I need Rebecca.pug, which I'm going to change the name to Rebecca. I need the Andrew route, or Andrew view. The Dean file. And lastly, the Cindy file. But for right now, I'm just going to be working with the Chris.pug file. And I will also commit that up to GitHub. Yep. Index.js? Yep. And again, the code is on GitHub, so if you wanted to open it up in your browser, you could just look at that as well. So again, obviously, this is not how websites are usually created. If there's going to be content that is going to be similar across different pages, obviously we would just create one view and then change what the content on that page would be. But this is just a good example of just kind of getting used to working with Pug and Node and being able to render those pages. So if you're still working on creating your views, that's fine, but as long as you have one view that's already created, that's going to be the important part. So in this case, I'm going to throw in a container just because a container will indent it so we're not right at the corners. But the one thing that we do kind of need that we don't have right now is we don't have any sort of menu bar for being able to change between the different pages. So usually I would just take the Bootstrap navbar that's on the website. In this case, I'm just going to do a bunch of hyperlinks and include that into our layout. So similar to PHP, again, if you don't like PHP, I apologize. It's usually the one that most people typically know. But you guys went over like partial files or include files, right? So typically files that we're going to be including, we put it into a separate folder to know that these are not fully fledged documents. They're partials. So I'm going to create a folder called partials. And then in here, I will create a file that is called nav.pug. So this will be our nav bar that we can include on other pages. And because this is going to be included into our document, we don't have to worry about doing any sort of extending. We don't have to use our doc type in HTML. We can just start writing pug right from the root of our file. So in this case, I'm going to do an anchor tag with an href that goes to /Chris, and that will be called Chris. Rebecca, Dean. Why is that staying? There we go. Cindy and Andrew. So here's our anchor tags, pretty bare bones, not much to it, but we're not going to worry about styling as of right now. We can start to prettify it closer to the end of class and make it a little bit nicer maybe. We'll just go over the actual creating of the website, and then if you don't want to stick around after we've done the functional stuff, you're welcome to go. So in order to include this into our index.pug file, or sorry, not index.pug, our layout.pug file, we use the keyword include. So you say include, and then you have to put in the relative pathing of where that file is. So you can say ./partials and then /nav. And if you save that and refresh, you can see at the top right here is all of our different names. And just by clicking on them, they all work. So again, I just said include, and I put this just below my body and above my content because I want it to be at the top of my document. Include, period, partials, and then nav. And same thing, commit that to GitHub, creation of nav, included in layout. I also encourage you to make commits as you're going. You don't have to push it up every single time. You can just continue to make commits locally, and then when you feel like you've done enough commits, you can push it up after. But it is always best practice to try to commit as you're going along, so that way if for some reason you needed to undo something to the previous commit, you can do that very easily instead of having one large chunk of code with a commit message of done. I've done it. But little tiny commits are a lot more friendly, a lot easier to deal with. But is there anyone that does not have a working nav bar right now? A couple people. What's going on? You don't know?
No,
I wasn't talking to you.
okay, I just.
There are other students, Vlad. I'm looking at the person behind you.
There's no one.
Do you understand perspectives, Vlad?
I'm just making fun.
You got me good, Vlad. Okay. So I'll just run over there and just double check.
That's an app of my own. Actually, I'm pretty sure.
Sorry, yep. And then just make sure that all your files are. No problem.
Do attention to the layout, right?
Yeah.
So you go to the layout.pug and then include /partials/nav.
Oh, you're probably still running it through Windows. Are you running it through Windows?
Nice.
No.
So you need to wait for this window. So if you cancel that and just type
Easier.
npm
And
space run, yeah.
That's fine.
yeah, that's weird.
Enter that. So that if you set it up, should be so that's where at the beginning of class we installed nodejs and then created a script in our package.json folder. If you just take what I've done on GitHub, if you just keep deployment down, then we'll just change it. You can do that. But just make sure that you have nodejs installed because that will detect file changes because it will not automatically. You need spaces after the words. Yeah. So it'll be the end parentheses space honey. No problem. Okay. So now with our navbar, you should be able to just go between the different pages. They might be styled a little bit different, or they might even be the same if you haven't ended up changing the content on it. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually start changing the content that is on each page. So inside of my chris.pug file, I'm going to be creating an unordered list of different things about myself. So I could put I am, and you can either hard code it or we can end up changing it after the fact. And you'll see, right now I'll just hard code it. So 24 years old, I live in Stayner, Ontario. I was born in Barrie, Ontario. I enjoy playing Rocket League. Yeah. I dislike, I don't know, I'm pretty easygoing. There's not a lot that I hate. I dislike loud people on the bus and subway. Very specific. I've been on the subway and the bus a lot lately, so.
People on the bus and subway?
Yeah, they're awful. Like, especially people that like have their speakers and they start like listening to music on the subway or the bus. Like, get rid of them. Don't need them.
I kind of hate people with like the Apple's like
AirPods?
not AirPods, earpods, like little early ones. And the early ones had the problem like when you listen to your music, everyone hears it, but you don't realize it.
But that's what a speaker also does.
Yeah, but
And like those people know that a speaker,
yeah, but
like everyone else can hear
people
it.
with speakers, they are all. But I'm
Well, we'll set up a pug file for Vlad, and he can hate people that also listen to music too loud that other people can hear. So if I open up Chris, so now I have my content that's on there. And I'm going to be setting up similar content for each individual person. So except for Chris, I'm in all the other files, I'm going to just put in what their relation to me is so that it's easier for me to know. Just in case if I forget who these people who I'm supposed to remember are. So for my brother, I'm just going to put in, he's 22 years old. He lives in Barrie, was born in Barrie. He enjoys using his PS4. And he dislikes pretty much vegetables in general. He doesn't like vegetables. And I am Chris's brother. So I'm just going to be going through each of these files. You don't have to do all of them. Just make sure that they are done for the lab. So for my dad, he is Now I feel awful. I don't actually know. I think he's 53. He was born in Thornhill. Oh, wait, hold on. He lives in Barrie and was born in Thornhill. He enjoys beer, and he dislikes everything that is not beer. I have a pretty simple dad. And I am Chris's father. This reminds me that Father's Day is coming up, and I'm an awful son and haven't gotten anything yet. So just reminder for those of you, don't be like me. For Rebecca, she is 27. She lives in Stainer, was born in Hanover. She enjoys, I don't know, I feel like I should know this, but I don't. She enjoys pizza. We eat pizza. And dislikes doing report cards. She's a teacher and has a bunch of report cards that she has to do. I'm so thankful that I don't have report cards. And I am Chris's wife. And I'm not even going to bother doing Cindy. I'll just leave it at that. So now if I go through between them, I have Chris, Rebecca, Dean, and Andrew all set up. But because we're passing information that might end up changing. So for example, I am 27 years old. Obviously that's going to change on a yearly basis. So we might end up doing, if we were storing these people in a database, we would store their date of birth. And then we would end up doing a calculation of how old would they be based on their date of birth. And we would send that to the front end. So what we're going to do is, instead of actually doing an API call, we're just going to pass variables from our index.js file that we can then use on the front end. So in this case, for Rebecca, I'm going to put age right here is 27. City residing is Stainer. City born is Hanover. Likes, dislikes, what did I put there? Pizza. And doing report cards. And lastly is one last thing of relation and wife. So now that I've set this up for just Rebecca, I can just copy paste this into a couple other ones and just change the data that's here. So 22, Barrie, using PS4, dislikes vegetables, relation is brother. And now, because I didn't want to write out Cindy's, I will end up using it a little bit differently. So 53, residing in Barrie, likes beer, likes, dislikes not beer, relation is father, relation is beer, sometimes. Oh, there's some controversy there now with my mom. She does not like beer.
She's up for wine?
No, my mom's not much of a drinker. And what did I put that I liked? Rocket League, of course. You know, this class is a little bit more vocal about Rocket League than the other class. I said Rocket League and it was like a dead audience. Like they're like, who cares? Play a real game. It really is. I mean, like you can just play like 5 minutes, although it's never actually 5 minutes. And then you can just like put it down and do something else. It's just when you're like 7 games in and you're like, oh shit, I should have gone to bed like half an hour ago. That's when it starts to get a little real. So in order to use these variables that we're passing in, we can actually reference our index.pug file. So right here are 2 examples of how we end up rendering a variable passed to the view. One is if there's nothing else that's going to be in that element, we can just use an equal sign, and that means that we're going to render a variable right after it. If we actually wanted to use text, that won't work because it'll say that it doesn't exist. However, if we wanted to include a variable as a part of a sentence, we end up using the pound sign with the curly braces around it to inject that variable in that part of text. So in this case, all of these sentences are all going to be injected in. So I can put I am age, I live in city residing, I was born in city born, I enjoy likes, and I dislike dislikes. So if I was smart, no, I'm not on that page. But when I go to here, you can see it's pretty much it is the exact same from the front end perspective, but now we're actually injecting variables. But right now it's a little bit unmanageable. As you can see, I have one file that is using a container. All the other files are not using containers. Cindy's isn't even set up yet. What would be nice is the ability to just use one file for all of these, which we can do. So, and I'm sorry for making you create all of these, but now we're going to delete the majority of them. I mean, it's always good. There is a little bit of satisfaction of being able to like delete code that you've made because you're like, I don't need it anymore. Who cares? So if I just commit this up right now using vars in index route, I'll push that up for you. So this is a great example. I'm going to be starting deleting code. So I want to make sure that I don't have any uncommitted code because if something in the next like 10 minutes ends up going wrong, I want to be able to revert back to where I was. So in this case, I'm going to delete Andrew. I'm going to delete Cindy. I'm going to delete all of them except for the chris.pug file because that's the one that already has my container set up. So I can delete Rebecca, delete Dean, and all I need is chris.pug. But using chris.pug for all of my files isn't going to make the most sense. So I'm just going to call it person.pug. The other thing is right now I have it hard-coded for what that person's name is. So this is an example where I can just use the equal sign and render the name. If I were to refresh this, well, we're going to get an error because we haven't changed what file we're using. So I'm going to change it from Chris to person. Refresh that. And because our variable of name is undefined, it doesn't render anything in that h1 element. But if I were to open up the inspect element inside of our container, you can see right here is our h1 that doesn't have anything inside of it. If we wanted to make sure that that name exists and then render the h1, we could do something like if name and then render it. So if I refresh that and I open my container, you'll see that I don't have the h1 here anymore if I zoom that in. So it only has my unordered list. So I'm just going to remove that for now because on every single page it should be assumed that we're going to have a name. So that way we can display who the person is. So that means that inside of our index.js file, we're going to need to add one more parameter of our name. So now, if I were to render this out, I have Chris, but I still need to change my other routes to using those names for using the person route. So I can just copy this one more time. Person, 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 and person. So now Chris, Rebecca, Dean, Cindy, and Andrew. So now our Cindy route that I had set up now actually has stuff that's being rendered in. But the one thing that we don't have is we're no longer rendering our relation. Because I'm using my chris.pug file, obviously I didn't want to put in a relation to myself, but these other routes do need a relation. And we can do that in the same way that I just showed you a second ago with only rendering the h1 if the name is passed. We're passing relation on all of these except for Chris. So what I can do is I can do an if statement of if relation. Then I want to render my li saying I am Chris's and then the relation. So I will push that up to GitHub one more time. Convert to person view. Add in conditional li. So now when I switch between them, you can see that Rebecca, Dean, Cindy, and Andrew all have an additional li at the bottom, whereas Chris only has the one that's right there. But we can also refactor this a little bit more. So inside of our index file, you can see that the code that's in here starts to get a little bit redundant. We have a writer.get on /Chris, and it passes this information. We have one for Rebecca, passes information, Andrew, etc., etc. So all of these end up rendering a specific person on a very specific route, but what would be nice is the ability to start using dynamic routing. So we could end up setting up for specific persons that if they're not in that, it'll 404, because right now if I go to any of these, it'll 404, which we want to do. But we also want to be able to have dynamic, just to have one route. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constant of persons, which is going to be an array. And then I will paste in all of these information that I have right here. And I'm also just going to add in one more thing just to make my life easier, is I'm going to put in a path, which is just going to be my first name, all lowercase. So we'll just paste those in. Path is Rebecca. By taking, as you can see, like the path that we're using up here is just the first name all in lowercase. If you want to take the person's first name and then convert it into lowercase, you're more than welcome to do that if you find that easier. I'm just doing it just with a path variable, just in case if for some reason we were to get duplicates, like if we had two different Andrews, we could end up changing what that would render. So I'm just going to also delete these router.gets as we get past them. So I've already used, there's just two others now. Path is Dean. And lastly, Cindy. So I can now just get rid of these and just have just my Chris route. But to change it into using a dynamic variable, in Express we end up using a colon. So a colon signifies that there's going to be a variable that is used at that URL route, and in order to access it, we use REQ. Again, REQ is our request that's coming from the client, and what that means is the client is also telling us where they're wanting to go. So we have the request.params. So params is going to be anything that is in our URL parameters, not the search parameters. And then because we named it name, we can just do that. So I'm just going to console log the name, even though there's not going to be much that renders on the page. But you can see right here, let me close this off. As I switch between it, we have Chris, Rebecca, Dean, Cindy, and Andrew. So we're getting that value that's right here. And I'll just reopen this so that way you can see it. So in order to figure out what is valid and what is invalid, because right now we've actually gone backwards in a way. Because this is going right off of the index route, we're accepting a name, but we don't know if that name is valid or invalid. And this is kind of similar to how we have handled our rock, paper, scissors. In some ways, it's kind of similar to how we handled the calculator for the valid methods that we can use in the calculator. We're going to iterate over our array and try to find that person. And what we can end up doing is if that person does not exist, then we can end up displaying an error on our page. So just to show you, if I were to type in gibberish like foobar, we end up getting a name of foobar. Obviously, that's not in our persons array. So what we're going to do is take this name that we just grabbed right here from our request parameters, and we want to look for our person. So we're going to create a constant called person. We are going to use our persons array that is up top here, and we're going to use .find. So .find is, it's kind of, imagine like a for loop that will return the first condition that is true. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this name that's right here and compare it to the path. So what I can do is I can say, if I'm on, let's say, the Andrew page, it'll first look and it'll say, is the path equal to Andrew for Chris? And it goes, no. So it'll go to the next one and then it'll look at Rebecca, and obviously that's not true. And it'll get to Andrew and it'll say yes, and then it will return this entire object that's right here into our person variable that we created down below, right here. However, if it doesn't find what we're looking for, it will return undefined, meaning that there is nothing there. So to set up our find, what we'll do is we'll set up PER, standing for person, but we can't use person because we've already declared it right here. So we'll say we're per.path, because again, it's called path right here. So we're per.path, and we'll use triple equals, and we'll say name. So where the persons.path is equal to our name. And as of right now, I'll just console log that person that we just found in our array, or did not find. And I'll just throw a comment explaining what this is doing. So we're going to search our persons array and find where the name variable is equal to the path in our person. There we go. So I'm going to put this to the side once more. Or hold on, let me full screen it, but I need this. Sorry. Okay. So if I go to Chris, you can see right here that we're console logging out the Chris object that we found. As well as we could do Andrew, and Andrew's right there. Cindy, Dean, and Rebecca. And if we were to go to one that is not valid, if we go to foobar like we did before, we end up console logging. It's in gray right here, so it might be a little bit hard to see, but if I highlight it, it says undefined. So we already know if it's undefined, that's an expected behavior of not finding the person that we want. So we can end up setting up a case for that. So what we'll do, and this is where I had mentioned before truthy and falsy values, we can just say if there's no person. So if there's no person, then we want to generate an error. But we don't just want any error, we need to be able to pass it to our error route. So you'll see up top, we haven't really touched on it this class very much, but instead of just having request and response, we also have a third value that's called next. And what next does is it allows us to go to the next available route that still matches what we're dealing with. And in this case, because in our app.js, this is a catch-all that is an error handler. So if I return next, because it's a function, and I say new error, I want to generate a new error and say person does not exist. And that's pretty much it. Express is handling a lot of this stuff behind the scenes for us. We don't have to worry about making sure that the error message is going to be generated, because inside of our app.js, this is where it's handling it right here. And then is rendered inside of our error page right here with the error.status. So I just return next with a new error and then give it a string value of what I want that error message to say. And if I refresh, I now get an error message that automatically gives me a stack trace, because when you generate a new error in JavaScript, it automatically does a stack trace. And right here, you can see that it's happening in our routes index file on line 68 at indentation of 17. So here's line 68, and it will do it right at the beginning of the word new. But right here, we say the person doesn't exist. And that's only if there's no person. So if we end up going to someone that does exist, it still renders properly. But we're still not passing that person that we just found in our array. And in order to do that, instead of console logging out the person, we can just replace this object right here with our variable of person. So pass our found person to the person view. If no person, generate error, and pass to next function. And like I said, you can think of next, imagine if you had a line of people, like, I don't know, say you're at Service Ontario, and when they yell next person in line comes. Similar idea, because everything is first come, first serve in our application, it will go to the next available route that is valid for it. So now, if I refresh, now I have myself, Rebecca, Dean, Cindy, and Andrew all rendering. And the thing that's nice about this is you can imagine that persons is coming from a database that's housing all of our family members. So if I wanted to now add a different family member, I could do that very quickly just by adding it to this array, or adding it to a database, or adding it to a file. Any sort of way that you would end up reading these names, you could just add it there. And then of course, because now we've moved it into a person.pug file, just one single file, if we wanted to make modifications to this file, we only have to update it in one spot. So similar to using like a function, we can do that. So there's only one other thing that I'm now wanting to do from a functional point of showing you guys one other thing that we can do inside of Pug, and that is called a mixin. Does anyone know what a mixin is? So a mixin is kind of like a function. And in this case, a mixin in Pug is you can imagine it like a function that returns HTML code. So right now our navbar is not that great, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bootstrap navbar and make my life just a little bit easier with what's here. I'm also going, so you can just ignore this part right now as I just convert it into Pug. So HTML to Jade, paste, copy. And I'm now going to replace my nav that's right here that's really basic with a bootstrap one. So I can get rid of that form. This is the disabled one. This is the drop down. And this is the home. So I'm just going to replace this with our people. So it was Chris, Rebecca, Cindy, Dean, Andrew, and it's /Andrew, /Dean, /Cindy, /Rebecca, and /Chris. So now, when I refresh, I have my navbar with these people. But I was mentioning mixins, the ability to reuse code kind of like a function, but for HTML. So there was a couple people that ended up getting an error at the beginning of class where it was saying there are only 2 keywords that you can use. And I'll actually do it right here. If I wanted to render an H1 right here, just saying test, I'll end up getting an error. So this is on the index page. And it says only named blocks and mixins can appear at the top level of an extending template. So when we extend, we can only put block and mixins at the very base indentation of our file. So if I wanted to create a mixin, I just type in mixin, and then I can name it. In this case, I'm going to call it a nav item. And just like a function, it can accept parameters. So I'm just going to call name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return this block of code. So right now it's not doing anything with the name variable, but in order to use our mixin, we use the plus key. So I have my nav item. I'm giving it a value of Chris. And right now it's hard-coded for Chris. But you can see that it's still here. So if I wanted to reuse it, I could just right here take the name and say name. And in here, I'm going to say name.to lowercase because I'm able to execute JavaScript code right here in the Pug file. Usually it's best to always do any sort of calculations that you're wanting to do in your controller and then pass that to the view. But in this case, I have a name, and it's the exact same thing. I just need it in lowercase form for my route. So now, if I change this to being Rebecca from Chris, and refresh, ooh, the end of the string reached with no... Let me just see if it's this part. I don't think it is. Sorry.
There be a slash before name that to lowercase.
Oh, yes. Okay, sorry. So slash and then name.to lowercase. And I will uncomment that out again. There we go. Thank you.
It was already there.
Sorry? The slash was there. It's just it was in a different format. So I needed the slash to be outside of this JavaScript function. So I'm using a $sign with the opening curly braces, and that allows me to execute JavaScript code inside of those. It's called string templating, string interpolation. There's like different names, but in order to use it, use these backticks. So now I can end up copying this four times. So Chris, Cindy, Dean, and Andrew. And now I can remove all these. And it still works the same. But it's now allowed me to be able to reuse code. So if I wanted to make any changes to this, I could just add in a new nav item without having to copy paste this part. So it's a little bit of complexity at the beginning to being able to reuse it later on. Obviously a nav item, it's a little bit of code, but if you have very specific structures that you're constantly reusing over and over again, you can create a mix-in so that way you don't have to constantly rewrite that code. The other thing that we could do is if I wanted to create a variable called names, and that is going to take, it's going to be an array and as shown before, I can use a for name in names. Refresh that again, it still works. Because now I'm iterating over an array. I pass that variable from each element in that array to our mixin, which is like a function. And then that automatically handles everything there. So as you can see, very quickly I took something that was 10 lines of all HTML, and now I've been able to reuse it, and now it's just done in 3 lines. But if I wanted to add in one other name, if I wanted to, such as Vlad, it's already there, and now I could just set up that person inside of my persons object. I could also go through some other code of being able to make it so that as soon as I add someone to my persons array, it will automatically show up in here, but we're not going to do that today. That gets into a little more complex stuff with Express. But hopefully, most of what I've said today makes sense. Not everything has to make sense. We're going to be going over this, obviously, week by week. But yeah, so this is kind of just your first intro to being able to use Pug, being able to pass something from the server into our view, and then being able to import and extend off of all of those different areas. So this is pretty much lab 3. You're welcome to style it up if you want it to look pretty, but you guys are more in the programmer. The web program, which was more for design, really enjoyed making stuff pretty, even though it didn't function as well. But you guys are more than welcome to do as much or as little on this as possible. Just remember that, I mean, everything that we do in class here, even though that it's basic, these are things that you could show when you are dealing with an employer. You can give them your GitHub, and they can go through and see, you know, if you want to stand out, you obviously want the person that gives more effort than just the bare minimum. Again, I don't want to encourage you to do more work than you have to, but it is always good to try to set yourself apart, both from a programming standpoint, but also just, you know how employers want to see that you can do more than just programming. Especially in a culture in tech where a lot of places are startups, you oftentimes will wear many hats. So at my work, I do a lot of like front end design. I do back end code. I do DevOps. I do like there's a bunch of stuff that I end up doing. So just being able to take something just small and show someone like, hey, look at what I did. I encourage you to do that. So unless if there's any questions about what we've covered in class or if you need any help, you're free to go.